here we are in Munich, in the English Garden, as they call it.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been walking a bit around the university center, the part of the university,
Mm-hmm.
seeing the old buildings, which are not even that old, but they sort of bear witness to a kind of golden age, a little bit, 18th, early 19th century,
Mm-hmm.
many of them, you know,
Mhm.
the time again of a Hegel. Munich itself bears witness to other cultural epochs, you know, Thomas Mann and so on. But it's sort of a kind of an interesting experience to see maybe the university like in a very traditionally rendered way. You know, I think that in Canada at least we have buildings, but they have no history, no age. They're easily forgotten a little bit. There's the institution of the university, but the moment that if that contract breaks down, which in some respects it has, the buildings more quickly lose a little bit of their value.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in Germany, you get a slightly more specific, particular, historical, universal sense of the university. But I'm not sure whether that means that Munich, say, is immune from something like in the internet, doing philosophy on the internet, whatever that really means.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think
Mm-hmm.
that could mean? Or what are we to learn from like very traditional ways of doing and organizing philosophy and philosophical learning?
Mm-hmm. Well, I wonder, I mean, were there any particularly important philosophers here in Munich?
That's a good question.
I'm not even sure.
It's a kind of an obvious question. I suppose it's just like the buildings are just stamped with the culture, you know, that you find all over Germany in the universities, whether it's Jena or Tübingen
Mhm.
or Berlin, you know, where many of the great German philosophers during that period, that was not, you know, it was a couple generations for
Mhm.
me,
Mhm.
and just in terms of the height, you know, from Kant to Jacobi and Fichte and Schelling and Hegel and Schopenhauer.
Mhm.
But yeah, I don't know many of the Munich, but I don't know if it matters. I think when you create a space, and it's a space that's kind of reproducible, so certain buildings with specific designs are made, and then a specific kind of curriculum goes around. I mean, we're talking about a time before Germany was unified too, which is also pretty darn important.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm not sure whether it matters.
Yeah.
Specifically, I mean, it'd be awesome to know, of course, and it, you know, it's a little embarrassing. Maybe we can't mention any great at least, or obviously great Munich philosophers.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. But I mean, in any case, I think in Germany, you know, people wouldn't necessarily even see the connection between Munich or even, yeah, the university buildings and Jena and so on, because there isn't such a sense maybe of the presence of that time as there is for someone who comes in from outside, so to speak, and sees it as something that is unified. I think in Germany it's quite unconscious. I don't know many people who really think there is a kind of intellectual lineage in Germany that's still going on.
I'm very
Seriously.
surprised to hear that. I think
Seriously.
you'd have to. I think if you asked them, they probably would recognize it
Yeah, but it's like
as
a
a
thing
historical.
of the past.
Yeah, sure, as a historical phenomenon. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And in that sense, like so many things in Europe, it's a kind of continental experience. It's sort of been secularized a little bit. It was already secular, but it's sort of been secularized in a liberal sense.
Mm-hmm.
We sort of protect it in a different way. We don't build buildings like that anymore.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which doesn't mean that German buildings that are made now are not great. You know, certainly like highly functional. Again, compared to Canada, the standards are outrageously higher.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, nonetheless, and yeah, there's a sense of protecting culture. Again, absent in Canada.
Germany, yeah.
In
Okay.
Germany, in Europe generally.
Yeah.
But it's become a more liberal, more secular affair in terms of, well, we do have a good educational lineage,
Mm-hmm.
you know, but it's a kind of stewardship.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be interesting to talk about, though, maybe some German philosophers who we have on our radar.
Mm-hmm.
I think of Marcus Gabriel, Daniel Pascal
Mhm.
Zorn, so
Mhm.
on. Who else would be worth mentioning?
Well, Sloterdijk, he's a different generation,
Yeah.
but you've been Yeah.
Yeah,
Very
different
interested in him recently.
generation. Who else?
Let me think.
I mean, in different ways, these people have made sort of impacts. I mean, Marcus Gabriel, I would say, was probably the most, in his generation, the most, he's not that old, 40s, 50s maybe, but he's been the most kind of forthright, appears on German television,
Yeah.
has written a number of books, did a collaboration with Zizek, more than 20 years ago, I think, but has
Well,
written
the books.
a number of books, I would say, that kind of are quite ideologically engaged. I'm thinking of his book on fictions, which feels like I would call it liberal philosophy.
What do you mean by ideologically engaged, though?
That he's attempting to reinforce a party line. This is not cultural stewardship anymore. This is the philosophy that Germany produces, and it generally is a kind of state philosophy. There are
Okay.
think about the effect of Trump, the post-truth era,
Yeah.
later
Yeah.
pandemic
Yeah.
on Europe. Right, it's this sort of, to an extent, a phenomenon from afar. Certainly Trump. You know what I mean? But I think there was a need to sort of set up a party line.
Okay.
To figure out where does Germany stand. Oh no, we have truth. In fact, we've studied truth for very long.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, we've studied truth long enough that we can even philosophize about what isn't true and falsity and
Right.
fictions, and
Right.
we can see the specter of a Trump and that ideology, from afar. We recognize it. Again, Germans probably have a sense of having lived through something like that
Mm-hmm.
with the Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that this also resonates with the fact that Marcus Gabriel's philosophy generally I find pretty conservative.
Mm-hmm.
He's able to sort of rehash, sort of almost canonical arguments from German idealism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But he almost seems to sort of doesn't entirely have the universality of it, I would almost say.
Okay.
Or the, it's an extreme period.
Yeah.
I mean, when they made those arguments, it was an extremity.
Yeah.
And it was at the height of Romanticism. And
Yeah.
again, they've been kind of arguments that get liberalized, secularized, not so interesting.
Mm-hmm. Well, but it is still interesting, perhaps, that he does see that intellectual lineage, because in something like, a very mainstream way of doing philosophy nowadays, they're not very interested in lineages at all.
I don't know whether he sees any lineage. I mean, his recent works, I don't see any does he write a book about Hegel or Schelling? No. So it's sort of it's a fairly casual reference, which is why I think of it as kind of like another maybe version of this liberal philosophy. It's not just establishing the party line, but also like doing a little bit of that cultural stewardship. It's like, we have these arguments when we need them. I can go on one of these sort of, abstract German television series, and I can mention a very strange argument about circularity or for instance, his argument about whether the world exists, famous. It's a very interesting argument.
Yeah.
It is a perfect example of secular German idealism. Again, German idealism is already secular, but in a rather complex way, because they have references to Jakob Böhme. They have a god figure, but it's a god figure who's been secularized. So it's quite a dialectical paradox, which I think fits in the philosophy. But when he talks about for the world, and he says, there is no world, and he tries to explain this through a German idealistic framework, in effect. Maybe for him it's an older framework, maybe it's a Platonic framework, or even Aristotelian. That would depend on his exact understanding of his own argument, but definitely there's a sense that, we can recycle abstract arguments, abstraction is easy for us, which seems to miss the point of abstraction, I would say. It shouldn't be easily explainable. Or
I guess in his case you could ask what he even means by world. And it's perhaps also almost a Kantian definition he gives, but it's like, what's your reference point for world anymore, right? Even as an abstraction that you then want to topple.
Yeah, I mean, especially or in a post-Kantian sense, neo-Kantian, we've retained the word world, but we don't consider it maybe a great transcendental project. Which again, I think his argument is a fair one. The question is, what are its exact limits and or specifications? Is it a kind of pro-transcendentalism? Is it an anti-transcendentalism? I mean, obviously there are arguments from France Badiou's great student, Quentin
Mayasu.
Mayasu, who writes about going pre-Kantian, but without necessarily, returning to a certain philosophical innocence.
Mm-hmm.
He just thinks of the transcendental turn as kind of a misunderstanding of, how we can think of ourselves in the world. In that sense, he has a sense of the world as a very meaningful category, not a totally abstract or transcendental category.
Mm-hmm.
What is something that's quite Badiouian, again, difficult to explain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What about, where does Zorn fit in? I mean this with no even remote sense of offensiveness, but he's a kind of a Twitter philosopher.
Well,
He makes ample use of these more kind of subterranean.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I feel like that's how many people probably have gotten to know him.
Yeah.
A kind of. I think part of his project has been to do a kind of not just logical analysis on Twitter, but is a kind of practice of logic and of applying a certain standard of arguing and trying to hold people to that. But then also in that showing the breakdown of discourse when people really don't want to be held to anything sometimes, the kind of troll phenomenon and so on.
Yeah.
That's one part. I mean, I don't think, I think otherwise he has a very interesting, he also published some more accessible books on philosophy, on, postmodernism, for example, and then also, there's a lot there.
It sounds like a great pedagogical project, which is quite secular and liberal, I would argue. Again, it's sort of like, oh no, I'll just accept it. I won't pretend to be a philosopher like Marcus Gabriel. Again, I don't mean that necessarily insultingly. I think Marcus Gabriel is playing the role of the philosopher, showing that role is possible, but it appears to me as quite a performance. Zorn seems to do more of, okay, well, no, the stewardship, intellectual stewardship, basically consists in being very exacting about argumentation, standards of argumentation. Mm-hmm. That's a very contemporary concern in German society at all levels. Mm-hmm. So that it makes sense for philosophy then to be the expert, as it were, at argumentation. Mm-hmm. That's what philosophy is about. It's not about arguments about God or the world or nature. None of the old, again, German idealistic concerns, or it even is not even that concern with the transcendental project or the critical turn, right? I mean, there's even sort of visions here of Heidegger's project in a totally secular sense, but that idea of going back to logos. Mm-hmm. Again, there is this temptation, it seems, in Europe, across the board, to go back to the world before the critical turn. To go back to like logos or the world before the transcendentalization. Is like a kind of logical error.
Yes, definitely.
Right?
There is a sense that maybe we've misunderstood philosophy if we think it to be about. These objects out there. The extreme form of that is analytic metaphysics. Yeah. Thinking that like a certain logic is kind of behind anything, and you get a totally big metaphysics of like, I don't know, relations and all of that, and people love formalizing that stuff too.
Or you produce a kind of linguistic autism. I mean, like someone like, what's his name, John Hawthorne, the Australian philosopher, or Hawthorne, where he goes on that series with Krauss is his name again. I can't remember everyone's name, but it's sort of his Closer to Truth series on YouTube, and he interviews Witten and various others, and he's like, Hawthorne basically can't even have like the most basic discussion because he's so fastidious about words and their setting, and it's not this hermeneutic, which I think is more the German or continental tradition, which at least is historically interesting. Yeah. It treats language as a kind of ontology, which is not beyond the scope of analytic. Maybe not metaphysics, but certainly Carnap and Quine do talk about the relationship between philology and ontology. But definitely, once you get like this kind of pure analytic or Anglo-analytic thing, you can't even have a basic conversation, which I would say shapes a very different kind of political society. Like Germany needs a great deal of language, rules, and precise definitions. it's funny how analyticity doesn't actually serve them very well as a result, or at least we might distinguish between two different kinds of analyticity, a sort of German continental analyticity and then an Anglo-Saxon analyticity.
Okay. How would you describe the German continental one?
Well, as I said, more hermeneutical. There's a greater concept of stewardship.
Yeah.
Again, the ends here being someone like Marcus Gabriel, who does a kind of philosophy as performance.
Exactly.
I'm not trying to put a postmodern spin on it, but I just see it as like we can occasionally rehearse arguments from history.
Well, can I interrupt there and say that even the way I think his books on philosophy are presented, it's like this, popularization of philosophy. That's very much the goal, and that very much, and I think you're right to say that the performance is totally part of it.
Though I think Marcus Gabriel's enjoyment is nonetheless that, yes, it's a vulgarization of philosophy, but actually I'm not necessarily going easy on my audience, which sort of I think reflects the jouissance of German society. They like their detail, their complexity, their history.
Yeah. Well, but there's a degree of control over it, right? You don't really get the sense that there's actually a questioning going on his part, like a self-questioning,
Which is very difficult because it's a hysterical phenomenon. This is where you have a very different version of continental philosophy, for instance, in Slovenia, with Žižek and Zupancic. Zupancic's most recent book is called Antigone, and it's an absolutely brilliant book on how basically, which is an idea that one gets already in Žižek, and they form a kind of troika, Dolar, Žižek, and Zupancic, but this idea of hysteria as a political category. Very difficult in Germany.
Yes.
The idea of being this kind of explosive I'm in my self-incrimination, it actually subjectivizes me.
Right.
My complicity in the system is what gives me a weird, not right, it's a kind of post-liberal category, a kind of, I'm political in being guilty, and therefore there's a kind of radical, dare I say, kind of Freudian responsibility. It's not a responsibility that comes from the law or from logos, which again is this kind of mystical category I think we should try and return to and also shape and in terms of Thorne and earlier Heidegger's philosophy and this kind of continental dream of going back before the transcendental turn. But this hysterical political category is definitely a difficult thing to philosophize. So therefore, self-reflection is politically dangerous. Here is an example of maybe an abstraction which Germans are not interested in. Self-reflection.
I'm trying to think about why also hysteria doesn't really fit within Germany. I'm trying to think about, because I'm not sure. It seems like, if you talk to a German philosopher about hysteria, they might not even think it's relevant somehow,
Well, they probably wouldn't really know what we mean. They'd want us to specify it. Do we mean, again, do we have to refer to Antigone? Everyone goes to Antigone, from Lacan to Heidegger to Zupancic.
Well, Hegel.
And we're talking, maybe, Antigone here is we can distinguish her from Logos, which again doesn't make a lot of sense. It's sort of a bad hermeneutic because you could, it's a character in a play by Sophocles with this Greek word. But again, if you really wanted to try and clarify and determine it for German society, it would just be, it's an abstraction that is so reflexive.
Yeah.
Right? Self-reflection is an abstraction that's very reflexive.
Right.
Which means you torture the content with the form.
Right.
Form and content kind of collapse a little bit into one another. You get a dimension of the unconscious. Again, you get a dimension of guilt, but it's not the kind of remembrance culture of Germany, which means, to me, the remembrance culture is we have it in hand. We don't have an unconscious. We just have a sort of, because we can see it.
Yeah, it's there within view. Yeah.
It's a politically, you can politically delimit it, which is not what hysteria is. Hysteria is, again, you become political when you cannot easily delimit your guilt, your schuld, your debt.
Well, I was going to say that hysteria also, and I think you see this also in Žižek and Zupancic and so on, there is a certain, it is also very reflexive, right? But at the same time, there's a certain irony to it, a certain ironic distance.
But not a postmodern irony, not a postmodern irony.
Yeah, but there is a... Yeah, but there is something, the humor, the kind of self-incrimination. I'm
Maybe it's something Balkan. I don't know.
yeah. I'm
Because
kind of trying to put my finger on
ironically,
it.
since the 90s, which when their philosophy I think partly exploded. I mean, the Balkans have had occasion to think of themselves as the unconscious of Europe, which of course is a category that then gets reflected and refracted in the Balkans itself. And Zizek, of course, has that joke about depending on where you sit,
Right.
the Balkans actually is a little bit further south. So Croatia, no, we're part of Middle Europa, and then you have to go a little bit, to
Yeah.
Serbia, and then Serbia, no, it's Albania. Albania, no, it's Greece.
Yeah.
But yeah, what do you mean then by, what role do you think humor plays in Slovenian continental philosophy, and how is this kind of a different philosophy, a different politics, maybe?
Well, humor is a way to take on reflexivity, right, without having to, how do I put this? It's a way to take it on, but also you're not really taming it that much. Because with the concept of, self-reflection, it's like you can, as you said, it's already very reflexive. So you can be like, okay, I'm reflecting on myself, but now I'm reflecting on the fact that I'm reflecting. And so you're kind of, you're staying, I want to say you're staying in control, but it doesn't quite fit it. But then with, the hysteria, sorry, I feel like I'm pronouncing it wrong.
Hysteria. Well, you're saying it like a German, yeah.
Okay, sorry, yeah. Hysteria.
You are German, so that's fair.
With hysteria, in Germany, people, if you're hysteric, or if you were to be hysteric, I feel like people would be like, well, but you know perfectly well what you're doing, right? So it's like they would kind of remind you that you are reflexively engaged with it, with the goal of kind of cutting through your reaction.
But in this sense, we have two different versions of reflexivity now and reflection. And, it's funny that hysterical, of course, in English can also mean very funny. Mm-hmm. And I think rather than mean that when you're kind of making a joke, you sort of have some kind of ironic control or ironic dominion.
Yeah.
I think what it is, Lacan has this nice phrase when he says that politics is the whole of metaphysics. And I think that there's an interesting fixation, whether you're Quentin or Gabriel or Daniel Pascal Zorn, though again I think maybe he's a little bit more special and maybe doesn't deserve this critique. But there's an interest in metaphysics. Either it's transcendental metaphysics, or it's pre-critical metaphysics, or it's Greek metaphysics, or it's some kind of Badiouian logical metaphysics, however you want to call it. But there's an interest in metaphysics, which is a political decision, to the extent that politics is not just another category, philosophically, vis-a-vis, say, metaphysics, the way logic might be, or ethics, or aesthetics. Politics is like, again, the whole of metaphysics. And the reason why a joke, I think, works so well in producing maybe a different kind of reflexivity or reflection is that, Zizek will say something like, or there's this running joke that who writes his jokes? They come kind of from the Soviet Union or from, Yugoslavia. And it's like, it's this constant question and or category, who's the author of the joke? It's quite a reflexive category even. We know, for instance, that the jokes are kind of written in the air. Even if I write a joke, there's a sense that it's kind of been written collectively. Or if not written collectively, it's been written kind of by society. And this gets at something rather important, I think, about reflexivity. When you have the torture of reflexivity, and I call it torture because there's this collapsing of form and content. It's, a better notion of hermeneutics is not, Gadamer in front of the camera talking about Heraclitus.
Okay.
And Heidegger, as interesting as that is, it's much more like, isn't a joke a better kind of hermeneutic because you actually get the unconscious? You don't just get a kind of ideological contiguity or continuity with a certain tradition that you kind of engaged in the process of, putting together the remnants, and then you kind of have this, again, ironic. This is sort of more if anything, the ironic dominion is something you find in the kind of continental, post-transcendental metaphysical tradition of hermeneutics, whereas the joke has an unconscious because the author is not simply unknown, but actively the known author is not even, it's structurally not supposed to be known. It's part of the structure of the joke that it's not known. It says something about the truth of the joke that not one person necessarily wrote it. So you're not trying to go throughout history and figure out who it was. It's a bad question. And I think that this gets at something really important about how do you manage reflexivity as a political phenomenon. You have reflexivity at its most explosive in the French Revolution, when reflexivity tortures society because you get this radical principle of equality that basically we don't know how to hold together. We don't know which political society is equal, again, to this concept of radical equality. Again, Antigone is a similar version of this. Hers is sort of a kind of radical defense of ethics, which later we might say Kierkegaard tortures in Fear and Trembling when he says, oh, you need the teleological suspension of the ethics, which is quite a brilliant dialecticization of that entire term. But it's like, anyway, towards a description of hysteria as a political phenomenon, the joke is the ultimate hermeneutic unit in that there's room for the unconscious, which is the ultimate reflexive category.
Right. I guess that is part of your argument here, right? That metaphysical categories aren't actually helpful when it comes to this reflexive, self-questioning stance.
Because metaphysics is already reflexive, you need, to put it in Hegelese, a kind of reversal of the reversal. You need not merely reflexivity, but some kind of reflexively reflexive turn, which is the unconscious insofar as there's the coincidence of freedom and responsibility. You don't just get reflexive freedom, which then you can produce a certain kind of metaphysics for, which say is German society. You can produce 1,000 laws, a great civil code, which can sort of control the principle of equality. That's always, to me, an illusion. It's the same illusion of metaphysics as a description of reality. It's basically pure ideology.
Yeah.
But how do you nonetheless get out of the circle of metaphysics? How do you not just, for instance, you don't want to just produce another category. You want a kind of category of categories, but without necessarily merely, again, producing another metaphysical category or a higher metaphysical viewpoint. You want a kind of total twisting of metaphysics. Again, you need the Lacanianism of, you need the whole in metaphysics, which is, of course, politics, but not merely reflexive politics, as in, the continental response to Napoleon was a civil code without Napoleon, which is basically what German society is. It's a civil code without Napoleon. Okay, that's also what, Gadamerian hermeneutics is. Again, Heidegger's more complicated because he has the fascist turn, but also maybe a more complex philosophical turn than mere hermeneutics. And so you need to defend the hysterical subject, which is something like, again, you need the reversal of the reversal. The unconscious is not merely another category. It's a kind of proper good negation.
But are you...
of category.
Okay, yeah.
Which coincides, again, here's maybe the supreme argument here is it coincides freedom and responsibility.
Yeah, but those are a lot of categories, right? I mean, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, it's true.
I feel like, you get this, I know you get this twisting, or like, I think I get that. But it's like you are, right now we are at a point in the conversation where you are giving us a lot of X's, Y, and so on statements, right? You said the joke is the ultimate hermeneutic unit.
But that's a joke in and of itself. This is sort of, just to make a brief defense of Zizek, who is rarely defended, this is his argumentative style. And it's kind of not an...
But you didn't say it as a joke, did you?
I said it ironically, but with respect to kind of the second version of irony, not the ironic dominion, but the irony that introduces room for the unconscious. Which I would just say, all that means is that, like, Zizek argues generally by saying, on this point I'm a Marxist, on this point I'm a Hegelian, which introduces irony, but in a really sincere way.
Can you explain that a bit more?
What I mean is that I'm not interested actually in resurrecting or reviving hermeneutics. I don't particularly care.
Okay.
But when I say, here is actually the true hermeneutical unit, I'm sort of saying, actually turns out people who don't care at all about hermeneutics, who you think are totally unhermeneutical, the Zizeks of the world actually do hermeneutics better, which is just a kind of subversive point. And honestly, it's kind of a hysterical point. It's like, without meaning to, you can do hermeneutics better when you introduce the ultimate disturbance to hermeneutics, which is the unconscious. That's the only way I could describe it.
Okay, so I guess, I think one important point about that point is that you don't do it with you don't do it as like a gotcha, right? Towards hermeneutics. It's not that, not that you invoke some like bigger standard, or you're like, oh, actually you're contradicting yourself. And
That's a very German way to argue. That's the continental metaphysics I think we're trying to qualify here.
the German way to argue, you're saying, is this gotcha kind of?
Yes, there's a gotcha, there's a category you've missed, you've made a logical error. In this sense, sorry, we must be critical of Zorn maybe a little bit.
Well, I think
Not necessarily.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, also with respect to yeah, I'm not sure.
Well, for instance, I like when Zorn says,
Well, I don't think.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I don't think he says the. You know, the logical
gotcha.
interventions, or the gotcha. I wouldn't even say it's a gotcha, because I mean, that's how most people, I think, see it, and they get very offended, actually. Like,
Especially on
even
Twitter.
Yeah, totally. Even other quote-unquote professionals in the philosophical field, they find it very annoying. Or, they find it annoying when it's like someone questions, this, like, there's also, for example, this thing I think that he often seems to run into with people, where they will say, oh yeah, there's several interpretations of, for example, Kant or Hegel.
Sure.
And, I think we need to get the strongest interpretation of them, and so on. Like, he's very worried of, like, people just setting up these kind of standards. And
But this is secular, and he should, and it's a good critique, because this is just secular arguing. This is liberal philosophy, which I think we're also trying to qualify here in calling it maybe continental metaphysics, because introducing these categorical distinctions not only assumes there's some neutral position, but also assumes that all arguments come in the form of some kind of logical empiricism, whereby we just have to find the right set of categories, the right metaphysical viewpoint, rather than engaging with these kinds of twists. Which
I do think he's interested in too, but it would be interesting to talk about how it comes out. I'm not entirely sure.
Well,
myself.
I wonder whether this interest in logos is, again, I'll be a little bit critical here, is a bit of an ideological turn. I think, for instance, the really interesting twist is say how the word analysis has two meanings. You have an analytic philosophy, but then you also psychoanalysis. And it's very true that psychoanalysis has been used in the worst sense by continental philosophy, and I'm not prepared to defend so many uses and interventions and interpretations of psychoanalysis. I like Zizek's, I like, Lacan's, Freud's points. I think there is an orthodoxy there absolutely worth defending. And it has to do with this, well, what if analysis is not, again, finding the metaphysical viewpoint, for which, you produce a kind of, if you really want to find that, you need Heidegger, because you need aletheia. You need truth as unconcealment, because logical empiricism only actually works if you already kind of are in contact with the truth, but you don't realize it, so you have to kind of get rid of the shadows. This goes back to Plato. Obviously, for Heidegger, it goes back to even the pre-Socratics. And even, some radical coincidence between physics, poetry, and philosophy. Everything is an act of creation, an engagement of being with the world, where you kind of remove the things in front of you that are stopping you from seeing things. You get this with Die Lichtung, in terms of there's a moment in the forest where you come upon the light. If you're not necessarily there at the right moment, maybe you don't necessarily see it, but you can see it if you're in the right moment. This produces even the middle philosophy of Heidegger in terms of the turn. Waiting for the event is a question of leaping towards it. Leaping itself becomes not a metaphysical category, but a kind of interesting, you have to be there to jump, you have to be there for the right moment for the light to be there. It's not light maybe as a physical category, it's light as an ontological category, but it's also, I think Heidegger is even going for something deeper than ontology sometimes. My problem with all of this is that if it ultimately just reinforces logical empiricism, which means you're still just trying to produce a metaphysical viewpoint. I mean, for instance, one example of a twisting of this that I think is sort of half successful, but not entirely, is Althusser's, when he says that you can't see everything from every viewpoint. But because this has been used by Tupinamba, STP subset of theoretical praxis, which is sort of like, oh, you can have metaphysical viewpoints, but the way of avoiding Heidegger's mistake that, I don't know, that it's a kind of ontological unconcealment, is to sort of just practically admit that there are moments when you can't see everything.
Okay, yeah.
But they turn that into a logic, which is there. So I know I'm running on a certain spiel here, but like there are two different versions of logic here. There's logic as continental metaphysics, which means there is a good metaphysical viewpoint from which everything can be seen. It's just a question of finding it. But the kind of Badiouian version with Tupinamba STP and in a prototypical form with Althusser, you clearly get kind of the logic which really exists in the world, right? Logic that doesn't have the transcendental problem, that isn't a transcendentalization, in which you unfortunately though you have to make a certain subjective decision about where you stand though.
Okay. Yeah.
For me, maybe Zizek enters as a third option here.
Okay.
Right? Or the option that shows how those two options are actually the same, because they both concern themselves with metaphysical viewpoints rather than just introducing the unconscious, I suppose would be my argument here. What is the unconscious? Is that another viewpoint? Is it a merely subjectively engaged logical viewpoint? I don't think so either. It's a non-viewpoint, clearly. Which I would argue generates more a kind of Zupancic-esque Antigone kind of hysterical politics.
Okay.
Right, so you get neither your German civil code politics, which produces a particular kind of philosophy, nor do you get the STP politics, this kind of, neo-anthropology with Karatani. What's the D? What is it? The D form, which won't be the commodity, won't be, the D exchange form. I think it's just relevant, just even philosophically, to say that they produce different political societies, and that sometimes we should critique the political society they produce as a means of actually critiquing their philosophy.
Okay.
For instance, the Troika have produced no particular political vision, which is actually an interesting analytical suspension, right? A teleological suspension of the ethical, you might argue.
Okay.
It just means that they've not tried to figure out Sittlichkeit. They've not just tried to figure out how do we get, Prussian society back, or how do we get back Greek society. Maybe this is a jumping off point for exploring a little bit more what we think Zorn is. Does he fit into one of the three visions here? Is he part of this critique that...
Well, I'm not really sure myself.
Nor am I.
So, but I think, I don't think...
I didn't say anything.
Sorry. I don't think he's just doing metaphysics. I mean...
No.
Yeah.
Nor just hermeneutics.
No, because hermeneutics assumes
Well, what do you think
the
is
author, doesn't it? Or that there's
traditional.
something behind.
Well, what does he say, for instance, about postmodernism? Because they concern themselves greatly with authors.
I think his point is very basically that his book on postmodernism is called Die Krise des Absoluten, Crisis of the Absolute. And I think he basically says, well, there was, they were all searching for some kind of absolute, and there's a kind of, I think he definitely thinks there's a missed opportunity in saying they're all just, post-truth or whatever, or they're not engaged in any of that search. I think he says it was just... Yeah, I don't think he thought that they were successful, obviously, in... Yeah.
Well, we've spoken about before with postmodernism that they ought to have been a properly universal political and artistic phenomenon. They should have gone back and reinterpreted all of political and artistic history, which sounds like a huge hermeneutic, but I would argue it's a very good hermeneutic if it's a retroactive one, which is of course Hegelian history and Hegelian philosophy, which I think again is an orthodoxy one should absolutely defend here.
Yeah.
But the way it would work is, they'd go back and look at the birth of linear perspective in early Renaissance art and late Gothic and say, oh, that was postmodern. But because they wanted to silo themselves off...
Yeah, they want to be something new, right?
Well, and this I have to, make maybe the obvious critique of postmodernism, that it remained engaged in a certain commercialism.
Okay.
That they were interested at the very least in rendering reflexive commercialism, which in a kind of cunning of reason sort of way ended up just producing more vulgar commercialism, Andy Warhol and so on. And I think it was a totally failed artistic movement. And in that sense, you get a different version of the absolute if you go back into history.
Yeah.
And you get, in fact, it's worth maybe articulating this with a little greater detail, because it actually gets at another maybe nice distinction, two different versions of the unconscious here, two different versions of the absolute, whereby, again, if you go back to aletheia, if you go back to unconcealment, truth is unconcealment, right? The Greek word was alethi, you get a kind of negation of of Lethe, which is sort of the ancient Greek river for forgetfulness. Again, lots of complicated etymology there, but anyway, the point being that that version of the absolute has always been beside us, which is, of course, a phrase from Hegel's introduction to the phenomenology, is there's one version of saying the absolute has always been beside us in terms of an unconcealment. There's this leaping, right? There's this find the time at which the light strikes right, for which Heidegger's maybe kind of quasi-brilliant description is leaping, is, okay, you have to kind of anticipate it, but your anticipation itself is an ontological phenomenon. For instance, anticipation is not a mental phenomenon, right? Here we think of Heidegger's critique of Brentano and others. It's not a mental phenomenon. Anticipation itself is a genuine act. One should think of leaping maybe not as a physical act of leaping, but as a, again, non-mental act of anticipation, which is a stunning description of reality. I don't think it's accurate, but I think it's quite beautiful. Again, it's very pretty, but again, to quote Rilke, beauty is the last veil which covers the horrible. The other version is the absolute has always been beside us in, and this is what I mean by twisting, in a totally brutal, retroactive way.
So retroactive, yes. Why retroactive? Because I think Daniel Pascalson would, in the structure of reflexivity, when he talks, like for him, basically, I think reflexivity is a very important concept, but it's more like reflexivity just shows itself in so many forms, and it's one of its, don't want to say properties, but reflexivity can just be thematized in so many different ways, and that's like kind of part of it somehow.
To me, I think
so.
Okay.
Yeah, and there is this retroactive structure to it as well.
But this is the problem for anyone who tries to defend reflexivity. Where does retroactivity come in? And it's not a specious academic point. Like, for me, reflexivity is freedom. Is it possible that we get an even deeper definition of freedom once we introduce a retrospective or retroactive dimension? I would argue yes, in that the other side of freedom is responsibility. So the really difficult philosophical and political problem, which is actually the problem of secular liberal societies, how do you think responsibility and freedom together?
Right.
This is, for instance, something that the French Revolution didn't understand well enough.
Yeah.
They understood reflexivity has to be established as a radically abstract principle. But true to the critiques of that movement, it was just an abstract principle. They got the theater right in that they were like, oh, let's remake the calendar and various other things, which I think is an important part of furnishing. But it becomes a genuine, I'll use a sort of weird phrase here, concrete history when you figure out responsibility. And responsibility can't be another abstract principle, which is, both a Hegelian and even a Freudian critique. Responsibility has to come into the world rather like a joke. It comes with the structure of the author without necessarily a particular author. Anyone could have written it. That's an interesting kind of way. And I think that the unconscious is, by the way, for me, the coincidence of responsibility of freedom.
Okay.
In both the radically political sense, that taking responsibility for your unconscious is the ultimate freedom and the ultimate responsibility simultaneously. But also, if you need Hegel a little bit to figure out how this, like what kind of reality does this generate, but like in terms of like the history that we take responsibility for, well, we're taking responsibility for a radical freedom. And this you need retroactivity to explain.
Yeah.
I can explain that.
Okay.
All I mean is that Hegel is obsessed with, there's this quote online that I see, I don't know if it's actually a quotation from Hegel, but it's like the only lesson we have to learn from history is there's nothing to learn from history, which is, Hegel's basically, the subject is self-relating negativity. When you get to a certain absolute point where there's just kind of pure abstraction, just kind of spiritual will. Again, Schelling, for instance, was very afraid of this point. He said, well, but, spirituality at that level is an act of evil. And it makes a war against being, and he writes this in I believe that the essay on human freedom. But I suppose Hegel was like, well, yeah, no, I agree, which is why you need to figure out how the heck does this freedom actually fit into the world. And Hegel's brilliant answer, which I think anticipates Freud, is like, oh, well, retroactivity, because history is not a linear continuum. We go back through a radical spiritual act and decide in some naive sense what we want to take responsibility for. Right? Lacan's definition of the unconscious is obviously not as something which is hidden, a piece of information which we don't know. It's a piece of knowledge which we've disavowed, right? It's a piece of knowledge which we know, but we don't take responsibility for. So the
Okay.
unconscious has a lot to do with responsibility in a capital R sense.
Yeah.
Well, isn't the ultimate twist here a true kind of Freudian politics or Zizekian politics is taking responsibility for the abstract principle of spirit itself? I don't take responsibility for a particular part of the civil code, or even for the civil code itself, which is a mistake Hegel even made in identifying the Prussian state as a kind of end of history. No, I take responsibility for spirit. What is spirit? Spirit is unconscious, in that spirit is this kind of moment of radical abstraction, which we can't necessarily fit in the world because it actually is the construction retroactively of the world.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And exactly of that which we take responsibility for.
Yeah.
So there's this crazy coincidence of opposites here.
Yeah.
How do we create a society from this? Or this is why hysteria becomes maybe one of the only kind of properly reflexive political acts, because it's like, well, you have to have room for guilt that isn't guilt for a particular thing, it's a pure guilt. It's guilt at existing, guilt at having the capacity to act spiritually, which you can never get rid of, and therefore you're always guilty.
Okay, but yeah, okay. I mean, okay, yeah.
Maybe I could explain it again through that difference between, continental metaphysics idea of the absolute and Hegel's, in terms of the lineage from Hegel to Kierkegaard to Freud to Lacan to Zizek, which is that, like, is the absolute something that was always already beside us, or again, wouldn't, I think the actual phrase is, wouldn't want to be beside us unless it wanted to be, which is sort of one of Hegel's weird phrases that I could see Schelling criticizing, rather like Schelling's critique of the end of the logic, when I think Hegel introduces the word Entschluss or resolve as far as how the absolute idea ultimately either expresses itself or ultimately produces nature. But yes, academicisms that don't fit into the academy, which is maybe why I feel hysterically obliged to mention them, because there is no...
That's fair. Yeah,
there is no encyclopedia I'm referring to, anyway, but unless there's also an encyclopedia Zizek's referring to, other than Hegel's, bigger logic. But two different versions of the absolute. One which, again, in my opinion, doesn't have room for the unconscious, right? Die Lichtung appears sometimes. Again, it's almost not something I can even fully describe because I think it's ultimately inconsistent.
Okay.
But it's like, again, you get this kind of anticipation not as a mental phenomenon. I have to... it's not that, again, that I put myself at a particular point in the forest, right? This is why this doesn't make sense, and this is why Heidegger had to write Sein und Zeit. He had to talk about time. This is why Heidegger is constantly trying to figure out physics in its poetic structure, because he wants to not only get back to that, but because he has to figure out, well, when exactly, like literally though, at what time am I in the forest? And I don't really want to use Einstein to figure that out, or Newtonian mechanics. So what am I using? Am I using Lucretius, or, again, obviously that's Roman, so I'm going earlier. What is it? But this is all an attempt to fill out a fantasy that is a fantasy, I would argue, because it doesn't really have room for the absolute equals unconscious. As in, there is a version of the unconscious which is only there beside us. Here the word want is actually quite brilliant because it's a term of excess, which is exactly what the unconscious is. The unconscious is, again, not just a kind of hidden structure, but actually a certain enjoyment, a certain excess, a certain thing we have to take responsibility for that is nonetheless empty. It's a pure responsibility, which is kind of overwhelming because we don't necessarily know how to structure it in terms of a civil code or a specific kind of inhalt or a specific kind of content, which is radically anxiety-inducing. But yeah, this absolute is Hegel's coincidence of radical reflexivity, so pure spiritual abstract principle that intersects with a concreteness that is not actually in the world in terms of a really existing object, but is the pure retrospective structure of my interventions into the medium of history. Here, history is a phantasmatic medium. I don't just intervene into history, I intervene into the very frame of history, the capital F frame. A good example of this would be if anybody's ever read Hilary Mantel, Wolf Hall, but more specifically A Place of Greater Safety, in which she talks about the French Revolution. And she talks specifically about how they were aware that what they were doing was historical. Therefore, their intervention wasn't merely, oh, how do I establish the third estate,
Yeah.
but also, if this is going to be seen as history, how do I itself manipulate the kind of meta-language which we're excessively generating? Again, here meta-language has a metaphysical turn. There's a kind of continental metaphysics here. We have to quote Lacan. There is no meta-language, but Lacan's weird dialectical point is just that meta-language exists as a purely phantasmatic turn. It does exist, but as a pure category which I manipulate itself. I kind of make reference to capital M meta-language, but it doesn't really exist. It's a frame into which I intervene. So, okay, Hegelian history is this then. The furnishings of history emerge as pure theater, i.e. they're entirely staged, insofar as all of historical subjectivity consists in nothing but my interventions into capital H history, which produce these kinds of retrospective structures, which allow me to organize the radical principle of pure freedom, which otherwise does not fit into the world. The last point, which is not a point that is easily discussed, is like, okay, where nonetheless does reality come from? Naive materiality.
Okay. Okay. I don't know.
Which,
I'm not very happy with all that language, to be honest.
Which parts?
I don't know. I mean, what do you mean structures,
But structure appears phantasmatically, so there is no such thing as structure. There is structure as a pure capital M medium, a pure fantasy that we only get to see retrospectively. So then the question is, why is there some excess called capital M medium, the framework? This, I think, Zizek has tried to answer, partly through Lacan, through objet petit a, which he says Hegel doesn't have a good theory of. But then ultimately he needs to go back to Hegel to get a good theory of history, because Lacan's version of psychoanalysis doesn't really produce a true subject. It just produces a kind of stunted, a subject that gets caught up in the master discourse and can't escape it. I would say that the only possible solution to which is not only to focus on the object as some sort of piece of excess, as a way to kind of show how you get these kind of decorations. Reality is trying to prove that it's real. It has these certain decorations. Reality.
But what is reality there? Sorry,
well,
why can you just say
okay,
reality?
Schelling's concept of reality, right? There is a certain God figure like Jakob Böhme, a kind of anthropomorphic
so
God.
there's a God now.
No, it's a secular God, which is already a point in Descartes. Descartes produces the ultimate secular version of God. It's called the cogito, but then Lacan says, but the cogito is the ultimate exemplar for the unconscious, right? That there where I'm not thinking is where I think, is what. And that's, like, Lacan says Descartes' version of the modern secular thinking subject is a subject that is structured in this form, in this way. There where I don't think is where I think, right? So this is the unconscious. It's kind of a brilliant point.
Can we get... Okay, yeah, I don't know if we have...
The only point I would want to make on top of that would just be that if you really want to explain this excess, the excess of reality, which I suppose is your hysterical point there, how can we even talk about reality? Where does the anthropomorphic God come from? I'm not saying Hegel has an answer to this. How does the absolute get there? And if it's this if it is this coincidence of freedom and responsibility, not maybe why is this the original dynamic that I think is kind of puts the question into kind of religious a way, like a kind of yin and yang sort of cosmic principles of balance, and you get late Schelling, which is a total failure. For me, I think the way one should think of it is, there has been a lot of emphasis, especially in Zizek, on reflexivity, but where does capital
but not
R...
actually as a concept, funnily enough. And, we've been using this, I think for Daniel Pascal Zorn, for example, it's about concepts in the end. And
well, that we can work with, because what if you produce a conceptual materiality? What if you say that...
Okay, that's more interesting, because...
Well, that's what Hegel means by history. Hegel means by history is a virtual reality.
Yeah, okay.
But then Zizek comes in and says, okay, well, the obvious Hegelian extension of that is then, well, the present is virtual reality too, because the present structures itself through historical virtualities.
Yeah.
So there's some underlying irreducibly conceptual structure to reality. This is not metaphysics, though, and this maybe gets us back to our turn. It's not metaphysics.
Okay, because I do find that hard to qualify, and how else can we say at this point maybe this is not metaphysics, right? Like, be, because I mean that is quite a reflexive point. I don't know if that's the important point, but I guess I'm trying to say, why can you say, or we or whoever, why is it possible to say this is not metaphysics, but then why is that not a bad kind of circle? Or
I suppose it's about, we're not trying to produce another higher logical and or metaphysical viewpoint. We've tried to critique and deconstruct that, and then we tried to say, okay, it's about a twist. It's about not just two different versions of the absolute as in two different metaphysical standpoints, but one being a metaphysical standpoint, okay?
Yeah, exactly, because if you say those are two standpoints, we assume our position is outside and so on. Yeah, we don't want to do that.
No, but the second absolute is our thing, which is not a standpoint. In fact, the whole dialectical turn here is the unconscious is not another standpoint.
Well, but that is like such an impossible phrase to me. I don't know. Maybe, because it is a concept, but I suppose it sounds too easy to me to say, oh yeah, this is something that, like disavow knowledge, like, but then, it's like you just give a label to the thing that you can't see, and then.
But you're trying to turn this into a knowledge thing.
Okay.
Which, like, there's a reason.
No,
because you're turning it into a continental metaphysical discourse. You're trying to find the viewpoint of the non-viewpoint right now, rather than seeing it as a torturing of the very category of viewpoint, which is the introduction of a certain degree of reflexivity.
But if you're saying that's not a viewpoint, you're still using the concept viewpoint.
Which is not see, that's the thing people often make this point. They say, oh my God, but you're using the word I just used.
Okay.
Sorry, this is the entire basis of psychoanalysis. Yes, but I'm using the word in a different way. Not only am I using the word in a different way, I'm showing you that the way you're using it is engaged in a certain fantasy. Right? So it's critique. For instance, there's a reason why the analyst sits behind the analysand. There's a reason why the analyst is behind the patient. Because they're not trying to have a conversation. They're trying to get certain words that don't just have a certain stupid freedom associated with them. Okay, tell me your life story. Let's construct it together. Your narrative. Yeah. Let's break down your trauma and figure out what your real truth is. No, it's like, let me find what your real capital R responsibility is. What's the weird virtual history that you have unconsciously been reinforcing? You've used all of your freedom to reinforce a certain capital M meta-language, capital F framework, whatever. Right? Let's apply this to German society. Y'all use the materiality, say, of the civil code. This civil code is pure theater. That's not a problem. There's nothing wrong with theater. But
that's where many people would already not understand or like.
Sure, but it's theater because it's not. It's either it's real, in which case it's metaphysics. So you have to go to some other higher level to defend it, or you have to say no, it's theater. Okay. But then how does theater nonetheless structure reality? Okay, you need some theory of virtuality.
Okay.
Is this merely okay? This is where I don't like postmodernism and much of continental philosophy. Oh, you get kind of Judith Butler. There's this kind of performativity in reality. That's the virtuality of reality. No, here one must be much stronger and say, no, virtual reality genuinely structures reality. It is what we have meant by structure.
Okay.
This is where you get this, I use the word viewpoint, but I use it in a different way. And I show you how your use of it retrospectively, retroactively, is kind of not quite what you think.
Right.
That's an important turn. That is kind of unconcealment, but in a much more interesting way. It's actually a version of unconcealment that you get in Wittgenstein, for instance.
Okay. Well, can I just say, I think that's an interesting point because I guess, quote unquote, what we've been calling metaphysics would try and, in advance, establish, what does viewpoint mean, and then.
Which would just be assuming it exists.
Yeah, that's maybe where you get a bad circularity.
Well,
we're more working, as you said, with a retrospective.
Well, bear in mind that metaphysics works upon a logic of surplus. It says, I know something about my project already makes sense. I assume it. It's just a question of finding the specific constraints of the viewpoint. Okay, so even before you found the viewpoint already exists because your constraints minimally assume it does.
Yeah.
And this means that all of the achievement of this in terms of what is the actual output is, okay, we have a certain logic of surplus. It works even when it doesn't work. right? I can continue to just look at it.
Yeah, because it's a kind of model, or
It's a model that doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily need to ever prove itself because it already assumes it exists.
Yeah.
So therefore, you've
Okay.
actually done all the difficult work. Something the German idealists would have taken great issue with.
Okay.
You know, just to explain that detour with Wittgenstein, which might also be illuminating on this point, is that, because I think there's actually an interesting historical bifurcation in terms of you could have gone with Heidegger or you could have gone with Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein's unconcealment is in the Tractatus when he sort of says not just, whatever that about which I cannot speak must I be silent about, but also that there are not sort of sentences that sort of make sense and then sentences that don't make sense. So this would be sort of Heidegger, you get the light and then you also get the shadows, right? This is sort of the original Platonic metaphysics. I know that Heidegger didn't like that. He wanted to go back to Heraclitus, for instance. He wanted to find a more version of the shadows, that could be seen maybe again as a kind of poetical physical phenomenon. That's at least my understanding or my reading. I think that this is not nearly sophisticated enough. And in Wittgenstein, what one finds is not merely shadows, but something much more rigorous and ruthless, which is, oh no, it just simply doesn't appear. In logic, there are no empirical statements, and therefore one doesn't get logic as a viewpoint. One gets logic effectively in a weird unconscious way as something which one already understands. Which is a radical theory of language, logic, and reality, which is basically the Tractatus.
But why is that not then the same as assuming your model kind of already?
Because you don't know what you assume. Before I can generate my model, I have to specify it. This is the constraint of all of continental metaphysics, a great deal of math.
Yes.
Wittgenstein says no, and he radicalizes this when he writes Investigations. Because in the Tractatus, he still gives a specific language form. Eventually, he takes issue with it and creates an even more radical version of a language which we already know we speak, but we don't know how. And this isn't just, again, the unconscious as in, there are a set of, intersubjective linguistic commitments that we have without necessarily recognizing. This is Habermas and all this horrible philosophy, Lyotard and various others. No, Wittgenstein's making a much more Hegelian, Freudian, whatever point. He's saying, no, it's not a set of determined categories. It's not that if we don't choose to use, the entire structure of our intersubjective communication breaks down. It's much more radical. Big wind.
Yeah.
His point is, language itself is simply something which we have to, basically, we already understand. This is kind of his version of the absolute or the unconscious. We have to take complete responsibility for it because we basically already understand it, but it's not a set of again hermeneutic or excavatable intersubjective or interlinguistic links. Here's the question: well, what is it? Is it a set of concepts in the sense of virtual materiality? There are really existing concepts. There's some, I think, evidence for that. All of Wittgenstein's concept of grammar, the weird way that he kind of wants us to basically use measurements and so on and respect certain life forms in order to come upon different concepts, seems to me to go in this direction. But again, it's not grammar as in, again, we have a specific content. And this is where, okay, can we throw Zizek at this problem and say, okay, it's the pure line, you get a kind of, again, radical, the subject is this pure abstraction, which is nonetheless kind of generated by this kind of excess responsibility, which is that there is some kind of capital M medium or virtual materiality in the first place. But how does that generate a subject? Zizek wants it to generate a subject insofar as there's a certain blind spot. And so, in other words, there's an incompleteness to virtual materiality that generates a subject that then has to negotiate virtual materiality. I'm not sure actually in the end if this works.
Okay.
Here I'm even skeptical of this. I wonder whether we have to go a step further and say, but yes, I like this idea that you have to transpose the division between us and the absolute back onto the absolute itself. I think this is brilliant, but I don't know. I think we should take almost more interest in capital R responsibility and ask ourselves, what specifically would the content be of Wittgenstein's language? If it's not just this kind of, I don't know, like Wittgenstein does come up with rather specific languages. That's not just that virtual materiality exists, that retroaction and subjectivity exist, that freedom and responsibility exist. That's Hegel's pure conceptual description, which I think is absolutely correct. But why nonetheless are there specific games? How do we defend the existence of specific games without necessarily indulging the metaphysics of intersubjective linguistic practice? I think maybe we need a deeper theory of materiality, Hegel's missing theory of nature, a deeper theory of materiality and material reality.
Why? Because what does that have to do with the language games?
Because I think the language games nonetheless uncover, not in an hermeneutic way, that something like, a tree kind of has some weird existence, you know.
I'm just looking at a tree.
Yeah, no, we're looking at a tree. I mean, the tree is kind of like, I think a tree is already conceptual. I don't think we have sort of trees and then conceptual materiality. I think trees already are virtual. And that there's a certain grammar for this, which only Wittgenstein ever approached describing, and maybe the mathematician Grothendieck, but that's another discussion.
Another story.
Whereas I think Lacan and Hegel basically come up with a pure conceptual framework for this, and Schelling as well. I think Zizek kind of radicalizes it. But what's still missing is this question of, okay, but why nonetheless are there sort of these specific grammars, not in the sense of a kind of pluralism, which I just think is nonsense, but if I sort of do coincide the tree with its virtual materiality, again, there's this obsession with division in Hegel. It's not simply a question of finding the division in reality, which of course is transposing the division between us and the absolute onto the absolute itself, but what if we go a step further and say, but isn't the most divisional thing a tree that is already conceptual, is already virtual. Reality is already itself the most virtually real thing. One doesn't need to search for a specific division between the tree and its concept of itself. That already that already is what a tree is, insofar as there is something called reality. And in fact, I'd even go a step further and say that there's only Wittgenstein's perspective really vouchsafes this, because only he is ready to kind of go to that weird kind of, dare I say, kind of spiritual position where he's like, okay, all the reality kind of weirdly already exists. We're unbearably immersed in it, but we don't get to extract some specific content from it. Divisional content is a sort of temporary mediation, but eventually the most mediated, the most divisional thing is the tree itself. So how do we just spiritually reconcile ourselves with the fact that reality exists? This is, for me, the perspective of the Tractatus, in a sort of prototypical form, and then the grammar for which is more radically investigations.
Well, maybe we could leave it there.
I think so.